Alright, 8.3 is factoring trinomials. So we're going to get questions that look like this here, and we're going to have to try to figure out what could you multiply to get that. And if you think back to last chapter, pretty much when we did those, I don't know if I'd write this, you could, but it's going to be a binomial times a binomial to get a trinomial. So our answers are going to look something like x plus 2 times x minus 5. The other thing that's unique to section 3 is that we'll always have a 1 in front of x squared. We're going to start in section 4 kind of up in the ante a little bit and having like a 2x squared minus 5x plus 7 or a 8x squared. And that adds another layer of complexity to it. Before we jump too far in, I want to look at, well, if we had a binomial here times another binomial and we get this answer, kind of like where does that come from? Because that'll help us see how to work backwards from this here to coming up with those. Well, one way to do it is to FOIL, or to look at it as though you're foiling. And when we FOILed, this x squared always came from multiplying the first times the first. So we do x times x, and that would give us the x squared. Then the c over here on the end always came from the L, that when we did the number that was there times the number that was there, that would give us that number at the end, the constant at the end. Well, now the middle term, that always came from the outside and the inside. When we did like x times this thing here on the end, and this number here times x, those two together, we could take and combine them and get that thing like plus 5x or minus 7x or whatever you have in the middle. And that's going to help us see, well, how do we work backwards to get what has to be where? All right, so my steps. First step, I go through and I just, well, it's especially easy in this section, is I figure out what goes in front there. And as long as it starts out as an x squared, you're going to have an x and an x. Some of them maybe will give you like a b squared equals or a d squared or something. Then you'd have a d and a d. The second thing I look at is the signs. Is it a plus and a plus? Is it going to be a plus and a minus? You know, what are the signs there in the middle? Third thing, we look at like what are the factors, and then 4, we choose pairs based on b, based on that number in front of x to the first. So let's go through and do some of these. Those steps I think will make a lot more sense as we go through and do some. And I have these in categories. So all of them are going to have a equals 1, because in this section we always have like a 1x squared. And these are going to have like a minus c. So we'll have like a minus 14 at the end or a minus 15. It's always going to be minus some constant at the end of the trinomial. Now before we go and try our first example, let's see what do these all have in common. And it's going to, well, if we have an x squared, we know we're going to have an x and an x there. Second, if we look here, we have this negative c. And that comes from multiplying the last and the last. Maybe I should quick write those in a second. So we have F, O, I, and L. So that comes from multiplying the last and the last. Well, the only way to get a negative number is to have a positive times a negative. Because a positive times a positive gives you a positive, negative times a negative gives you a positive. So if we have a negative, it has to be a plus and a minus. And it doesn't really matter what order you put them in. You could do a minus and a plus, but we know that has to be true. Now, when I go through and do outside and inside, and I don't think I'd write this down, but when I go and do outside, that's going to give me a minus some number of x's, because I'll have a negative number here times an x. Now, when I go and do the insides, that's going to give me a positive number times an x. That'll give me a plus something x. So those two are kind of working against each other, because some of my negative x's and some of my positive x's will cancel to give me this middle term. So b then, that number of x's that are left when some have canceled, has to be the difference of these two numbers, the difference between the number of positives and negatives. And I wanted to write that in. So b equals the difference between the factors. And that word factor there may surprise you a little bit, but basically you're figuring out these numbers here multiplied give us the last, so those have to be like factors for that number there. Alrighty then. The larger number is going to have the same sign as b between those, because that's the amount that's left as well. So let's go through and look at some of these. As you do these in the homework, I'd recommend right away when you get a question like this next one, write the parentheses. Some people, they just kind of stare at it and they feel all stuck. Having the parentheses gives you something to aim for, something to fill in there. And then let's go and do them in order. So I have my steps up here. So write the parentheses and then put in those first two things. If we have an x squared, we have to have an x and an x. So I'll write that in. So we have x and an x. And that's what gives us that thing right there. Second step, we look at the signs. Well, we have a minus 14 right there, so we know we have to have a plus and a minus. So we have that. All right, now, third thing, we look at the factors. We look at, all right, what do we multiply to get 14? There's not a ton of options. So for 14, we could do a 1 times a 14, and you could do the little connection if you want to. We could divide 14 by 2, and that gives us a 7. So 2 times 7 would be factors, and that is all. Okay? So we know our numbers in here then are either going to be a 1 and a 14, or a 14 and a 1, a 2 and a 7, or a 7 and a 2. Well, we can use this line here to figure out which pair it has to be, because b, the number in front of x to the first, is the difference between the factors. So it can't be 1 and 14, because that is a difference of 13. You do 14 minus 1. So 2 and 7 have to be my factors. So it's either 2 and 7 or 7 and 2. And because we ended up with more negatives here, the 7 has to be paired with the negative. So it's an x plus 2 and an x minus 7. And if I lost you a little bit there, we could always look at y. So, well, when we were to FOIL, first times first gives me x squared, and last times last would give me my minus 14. Then if we look at, well, outside gives me minus 7x, inside is plus 2x. So if you're looking at those, a negative 7x plus 2x, when you combine those together, you just get a minus 5x. Right there in the middle. So we are done. So I kind of like these. It's not just like guessing and checking. There's a pattern that you go through to do them. Let's do a couple more, and that'll help cement it in your brain, I'm hoping. So we get this by doing F, O, I, and L. So first step, write the parentheses, and then put in at the beginning we have to have an x and an x. Because of this x squared, we know it's an x and an x. All right, now we have a minus 15, so we know we have to have a plus and a minus, or a minus and a plus. I'm just going to always do plus and a minus. Then, factors for 15. So we have a 1 and a 15, and we have a 3 and a 5. So we have those. Well, if you remember, you could have even stopped at the 1 and the 15, because that is going to be the difference. 14 is the difference between the factors. So as soon as you see that, you know it has to be the 1 and the 15, because those are 14 apart. And we need to have the 15, the bigger number, with the positives, because I have 14 positives left over when those get done canceling with each other. So I'm going to put my 15 here, x plus 15 and an x minus 1. And if you want to check it quick, well, we can check the foiling thing. X times x does give me the x squared. And then the last is 15 times a negative 1, so negative 15. And then outside is minus 1x, inside plus 15x, for a total of plus 14x's. All right, let's blaze on ahead. So one more in this section. We have, all right, maybe I'll write my FOIL. So first step, write the parentheses. After you're done with the parentheses, you could put in an x and an x, because this thing here is the first step, and that tells us, all right, we have our x squared. Second step is to look at the signs. So second step, look at those. And we have a minus and a minus. And really, the middle minus doesn't matter. We're really, maybe should have just did a sign to that right there. But if we have a minus there, we know we need to have a plus and a minus. So x plus and an x minus. All right, third step is we're figuring out factors for the 8. So I have a 1 and an 8, and I have a 2 and a 4. So again, not a lot of options yet. And once we have those factors figured out, we can pick which one by looking at that number right there. That's a 2. So we need factors that are 2 apart. So it has to be my 2 and my 4. And the bigger number has to go with the negatives because of that. All right, me numbering all these, I'm not sure that's being helpful. Sorry, I'm scrambling your brain. All right, so we have that. And at this point, you can be certain you're right, but it's probably smarter to double check. But I have a x times x gives me my x squared. And then, we do it in order this way. Minus 4x plus 2x gives me a minus 2x. And then positive 2 times negative 4 gives me negative 8. So we are good. So that's 3 examples from that type. And let's jump down to page 2. These here are going to have a positive c over at the end. So we notice a positive constant, a positive number there. So there's 2 ways. Well, and again, if we go back to the beginning, that came from foiling, so F, O, I, and L. So this positive number comes from multiplying the last 2 together. So I could have an x plus some number and an x plus some number, because when I do a positive times a positive, that's going to give me a positive c. But that's not the only option. You're also going to have option of an x minus and an x minus, because when I do a negative number times a negative number, it gives me a positive. So we have 2 different options here. But if we look at that middle number, so if we have this here, you see I have a plus or minus in there, so it could be either. Well, if that comes from the outside and the inside, when I look at this one, if I do my outside and my inside, I'm going to get a positive for sure, because I have a positive number of x's plus another positive number of x's. So it's going to be x plus x plus. If the middle term in the trinomial is something like plus 5x or plus 7x or plus x, so if this has a positive b, it has a positive number in front of x to the first. And when we look at the second one over here, if we do outside and inside, that's going to give us some negative number of x's and then another negative number of x's. So we can write for those if we have a minus b. So that's going to be what you have if you have like a minus 5x or a minus 7x or something like that. In this case, because they're either going to both be positive or both be negative, that number b in front of x to the first isn't going to be the difference of the factors, it's going to be the sum of the factors. So equals the sum of the factors. But other than that, really, it's kind of the same thing as we've been doing in the last stuff. So only a couple examples here, and we will be done. All right. So first, start out by writing your parentheses. And then when we're looking at it, and we know we have an x squared right there, we know we have to have an x and an x. Now, some people will go through and they'll like just try to memorize plus, minus, minus, plus, all this kind of stuff. But for me, when I see a plus x, I know they're going to be the same. All right, so my signs are going to be the same. So I'll either have x plus and x plus or x minus and x minus. And I look at this thing right here. Well, if it's negative, it has to be my 2 negative options. So you could try to memorize like minus plus is going to be minus minus, and plus plus is going to be plus plus. I just look at it and reason through it each time. All right, now second thing is we figure out, well, what could my factors be? So we're working off of that 6 there at the end. So my 6 could be a 1 and a 6, or it could be a 2 and a 3. So we have those 2 options. Well, I need to have the total be this 5 right there. So I'm looking for the 2 that add up to 5. So that's going to be my 2 and my 3. And it doesn't matter if you write x minus 2 or and then an x minus 3 or the other way around, because they'll both be minuses. So good to check answers. Well, when we FOIL, we have x times x gives me my x squared. And my outside minus 3x, inside minus 2x for a total of minus 5x. Negative 2 times negative 3 gives me a positive 6. All right, 1 to go, and then we'll be done. So, all right, start out with this here, write your parentheses, and then we know the first term, if it's an x squared, gives us an x and an x. We write that in. And next we look at the signs. Once we see we have this plus 12 over here, we know it's either a plus plus or a minus minus. If we have a plus here, well, the minus minus won't work, so that always gives me a negative number of x's. It has to be the plus and the plus. So x plus, x plus. Third step, we look at the 12 and we try to figure out factors. We got a few more juicy options here. We have a 1 and a 12. We have a 2 and a 6. And we have a 3 and a 4. Well, whichever one of those we end up using has to have a total, a sum of positive 13. So 3 and 4 would give me a total of 7, so not that. 2 and 6 gives me an 8, so it has to be my 1 and my 12. And because it's going to be x plus 1 and x plus 12, it doesn't matter which one we put where, because they're both positive. Good to check answer when you're done. X times x, x squared, plus 12x plus 1x gives me a plus 13x, and a positive 12 there at the end. So there she is. I think once you get the hang of it, I think you'll enjoy doing these. Let me know if you have questions. I'm glad to help you in class. Thanks, guys.